June 5, 1944. Darkness blanketed the French coastline. Along the beaches of Normandy, the Atlantic wall loomed like a shadow of doom, its bunkers, gun emplacements, and minefields silent under the moonlight. Inside, German soldiers moved quietly, checking weapons, whispering orders, and shivering in the cold wind that swept across the cliffs. The tension was palpable, heavier than any storm that could rise from the sea. In command posts, officers pored over maps by lantern light, tracing the dunes and hedgerows where they expected the enemy to arrive. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, ever vigilant, paced along the sand with his trusted aides, inspecting obstacles and envisioning every possible landing scenario. Mines were buried, wire entanglement stretched, and concrete bunkers reinforced. Yet, despite all preparation, even the most seasoned soldiers could not shake the sense of unease. Something in the air, a subtle movement of ships far off the horizon, the hum of distant aircraft, whispered that the long-anticipated moment had finally arrived. Orders had been repeated countless times: hold the coast, repel the invaders, leave no inch. But many soldiers were young, barely out of training, and they exchanged nervous glances. Rumors circulated, tales of massive fleets, paratroopers landing behind lines, waves of bombers sweeping inland. Some tried to joke, others prayed silently. The sea, calm and glimmering under the stars, belied the chaos that would erupt at first light. Hitler, far from the front, slept in Bavaria, confident in his Atlantic wall and the Atlantic's icy waters to keep the Allies at bay. Yet the commanders on the ground knew the weight of expectation rested squarely on their shoulders. They would be the first to feel the storm of steel, fire, and courage that was coming. And as the night deepened, a tense silence settled over Normandy, the quiet before the longest day in history. By dawn, that silence would shatter. Every bunker, every machine gun nest, every mine would be tested. The men on the beaches could sense it, the calm that precedes the storm. They lit cigarettes in the dark, wrote hurried letters, or stared into the horizon, knowing that with the sunrise, their lives, and the course of the war, would change forever. The Atlantic wall was ready, but the world beyond it was moving. The invasion fleet, massive and unstoppable, slipped silently through the channel, and in the shadows of the night, the fate of Europe hung in the balance. Before the first boots hit the beaches, the war had already come to Normandy in the dead of night. Around midnight on June 5, 1944, German outposts reported strange shapes descending from the sky. At first, officers thought it was reconnaissance or a minor raid. But within moments, the truth became impossible to ignore. Paratroopers were landing behind their lines, cutting roads, seizing bridges, and throwing the Wehrmacht into chaos. In villages across the Cotentin Peninsula, startled German soldiers scrambled from their billets. Lanterns flickered across cobblestones as orders were shouted through the mist. Communications lines were torn down, telephone poles shot through by stray fire, and radio messages crackled with panic. Soldiers who had spent months preparing for a coastal assault now faced an enemy where they least expected it, in their rear. The Americans of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, and the British 6th Airborne, had been dropped across a wide area, often miles off target. Some landed in flooded fields, wading through icy water while bullets tore through the night. Others crashed into trees, barns, or directly onto German positions. Chaos ruled from the start. Yet, amid this disorder, the paratroopers executed their objectives with precision born of rigorous training. Key bridges were captured, crossroads seized, and German communications disrupted before dawn. In St. Mireglise, the first town to be liberated by airborne troops, German sentries were bewildered. Flames from burning buildings illuminated the dark sky as paratroopers moved silently yet decisively through the streets. Some local villagers, terrified yet brave, guided the soldiers through the maze of hedgerows and narrow lanes. Every step the Allies took behind German lines multiplied the pressure on the coast, forcing commanders to divert units that would otherwise have been waiting for the beach assault. The psychological impact was immediate. German soldiers who had expected a frontal assault now realized that the Allies were operating in their rear. Reports of landings spread like wildfire, parachutes drifting over forests, strange vehicles moving in the shadows, and sudden firefights erupting where none should exist. Commanders struggled to comprehend the scope. Could this be the main attack, or was it a feint? Doubt gnawed at every level of leadership. Field units that might have reinforced the coast found themselves immobilized, hunting invisible enemies. Roads were blocked, bridges destroyed, and towns briefly held by lightly armed American and British paratroopers. The paratroopers' presence forced the Germans to react piecemeal, never as a coordinated whole. The advantage of position that the Wehrmacht had depended on for years began to crumble. By 3 a.m., the extent of the airborne assault became clear. The paratroopers had not merely arrived, they had set the stage for the amphibious landings that would follow at dawn. German troops, still recovering from the shock, could only send fragmented reports up the chain of command, many of which were dismissed as exaggeration. The Allies' deception, Operation Fortitude, had worked. German intelligence still believed the main landing would come at Pas-de-Calais, leaving Normandy lightly defended. Amid the confusion, the soldiers on the ground did what they could. Machine guns were repositioned, artillery crews scrambled to targets they could barely see, and officers attempted to rally men who were exhausted, cold, and disoriented. Yet the airborne troops were everywhere, in woods, in fields, in villages, striking swiftly and vanishing into shadows before the Germans could mount an effective counter. By the time the first light of June 6 broke over Normandy, the paratroopers had sown maximum disorder. Roads were impassable, reinforcements delayed, and German command struggling to regain control. The beaches would not be met by a fully prepared defense, but by an army already reacting to chaos behind its lines. The first alarm of D-Day was not the roar of naval guns on the shore, it was the quiet, deadly whisper of soldiers descending from the sky. Paratroopers behind the lines had rewritten the battlefield before the sun even rose, proving that the war on D-Day would be won not only with brute force but with courage, timing, and daring that defied expectation. By dawn, the German defense was already fractured. Bridges had been seized, crossroads blocked, and units isolated. The quiet of the night had become a nightmare, and the Wehrmacht would pay for every hour of delay as the invasion fleet approached. The paratroopers had set the stage for history, and the first alarm of D-Day would echo through the chaos of the day, reminding both sides that in war, the unseen attack can be just as deadly as the one in plain sight. As the first light of June 6, 1944, crept over the horizon, Normandy awoke to a nightmare that no one could have fully anticipated. The beaches, once calm under the early morning mist, were now transformed into a maelstrom of fire, smoke, and blood. The thunder of naval guns merged with the screams of men and the deafening roar of artillery. Explosions shook the sand, sending plumes of water, debris, and sand into the air. The Atlantic Wall, designed to repel any invasion, now bore the full weight of the Allied assault. Landing craft churned through the surf, tossing soldiers into frigid water as the first ramps dropped. Men struggled against the tide, their gear dragging them down, their rifles heavy in the icy waves. Bullets tore through the surf, ripping into bodies before they even reached the sand. Mines buried just meters from the shoreline erupted with deadly precision, hurling men into the air and leaving the beaches littered with twisted metal and shattered bodies. The sea itself became a graveyard, swallowing the wounded, the exhausted, and the unlucky. Omaha Beach, the most heavily fortified landing site, became the epicenter of chaos. German machine guns fired relentlessly from hidden bunkers, mowing down the first waves of troops. The planned naval bombardment had failed to neutralize most of the defenses, and many tanks intended to provide support sank before they could reach the shore. Officers were cut down, radios destroyed, and communication fractured. The invasion plan, honed for months in meticulous detail, unraveled under the sheer brutality of the initial assault. Yet amid this inferno, courage emerged. Small groups of men, often separated from their units, clung to life and moved forward inch by inch. Medics treated the wounded under unrelenting fire, engineers cleared mines with trembling hands, and soldiers pulled the injured from the surf. Every movement was a battle, every step a gamble with death. The chaos was not just physical, it was mental. Fear, adrenaline, and determination collided, driving men to acts of heroism that would become the stories of D-Day. Behind the lines, German commanders struggled to respond. Reports flooded in, contradictory and confusing. Some units believed the landings were a diversion, others realized the scale of the assault but lacked the authority to act decisively. Field Marshal Rommel was absent, attending to personal matters in Germany, leaving subordinates to grapple with the unprecedented onslaught. Hitler, miles away, would not release armored reinforcements without confirmation, a hesitation that sealed the fate of the German coastal defenses. The Allied paratroopers, already behind enemy lines, compounded the chaos. Roads were blocked, bridges seized, and German units isolated. The Wehrmacht, trained for rapid response, now moved in fits and starts, their coordination broken by fear, misinformation, and surprise. Tanks that might have counterattacked were delayed or destroyed by air superiority and the relentless pressure of the landings. Every hour gained by the Allies tilted the balance further in their favor. As the sun climbed, the initial slaughter gave way to grim determination. Beachheads were established, however tenuously. Engineers and infantry linked fragmented positions, turning isolated pockets of survival into a foothold on the continent. The tide of battle began to shift, not because of overwhelming force, but because human will refuse to be broken. The beaches, once the domain of fear and death, became the proving ground of courage, where ordinary men did the extraordinary. Chaos at dawn was total, a storm of fire, fear, and heroism, but it was only the beginning. The Normandy coast had become a crucible where the fate of Europe would be forged, and the men who survived would carry the scars and the stories for the rest of their lives. D-Day had begun, and with it, the invasion that would turn the tide of history. By the time the sun fully pierced the mist of June 6, 1944, the full scale of D-Day's horror had become apparent on the beaches of Normandy. Omaha, the most dreaded of the landing zones, stretched like a scarred crescent under relentless fire. The Americans faced a nightmare their training had never fully prepared them for, the cliffs bristling with German bunkers, hidden machine guns, mortars firing in deadly arcs, and a shoreline littered with mines, barbed wire, and the remains of fallen comrades. Every step forward was paid for in blood. Landing craft discharged wave after wave of troops into the icy surf. Many were swept off their feet, dragged under by the weight of gear and gunfire. Those who made it to the sand were immediately pinned down. Officers fell, radios were destroyed, and chains of command broke under the chaos. The German defenders, entrenched and confident, had studied the likely invasion points and were ready to unleash hell. They aimed not just to kill, but to crush the spirit of every soldier who dared touch their shores. Yet amid this overwhelming carnage, pockets of courage emerged. Small groups of men clawed their way forward, using the bodies of the fallen as shields and scaling the cliffs under withering fire. Medics waded into the surf, dragging wounded soldiers to relative safety, while engineers worked feverishly to clear mines and cut paths through obstacles. The beach became a patchwork of survival and sacrifice, a place where one man's courage could save a dozen lives, and one act of heroism could tip the balance inch by inch. By mid-morning, the Americans at Omaha had begun to consolidate scattered groups into something resembling units. They seized small footholds among the sand dunes and bluffs, gradually pressing inland despite relentless German counterfire. Artillery from offshore ships targeted German positions, but the barrage often fell short or buried men under rubble without clearing gun nests. Communication remained chaotic, yet the soldiers adapted, improvising leadership and forming ad hoc strategies. Each house taken, each bunker silenced, was a hard-won victory, measured in feet rather than miles. To the east, Juno Beach presented a different challenge for the Canadian forces. While resistance was less brutal than at Omaha, the fight was no less intense. The Germans had fortified strongpoints along the coastline, and beach obstacles, mines, and machine gun fire forced the Canadians to advance methodically. Units surged forward in coordinated assaults, with tanks and infantry supporting each other under enemy fire. Casualties mounted, yet unlike the isolated chaos at Omaha, Canadian forces could exploit coordination and momentum to drive inland more steadily. Villages like Courseulles-sur-Mer became focal points, with street-to-street fighting reminiscent of urban warfare, despite the open beaches leading to them. Both beaches illustrated the grim calculus of war, lives exchanged for ground, bravery measured against deadly precision. On Omaha, every inch gained required extraordinary endurance. On Juno, progress was slower but steadier, a testament to planning and discipline under fire. Air support and naval bombardments gradually suppressed German positions, allowing medics to evacuate the wounded and engineers to clear paths for reinforcements. By evening, the Americans and Canadians had established tenuous but critical beachheads, linking their positions with units that had survived the initial slaughter. The cost of D-Day was staggering. Thousands lay dead or wounded across the sands, their names unrecorded, their stories left untold. Yet for every life lost, another gained the chance to advance inland, secure the beaches, and create a foothold for the liberation of Europe. Omaha and Juno were more than beaches, they were crucibles where courage, sacrifice, and sheer human will determined the outcome of the largest amphibious invasion in history. By nightfall, both beaches were partially secured, the blood-soaked sand giving way to tentative fortifications. Communications improved, supply lines began to reach the front, and the surviving soldiers prepared for the battles to come. Omaha and Juno had been hell incarnate, yet from their chaos emerged hope, a foothold, however fragile, upon which the Allies would build their advance. The fighting had cost everything, but it had given the Allies something no map could measure, the beginning of the end for Hitler's Atlantic Wall and a new path toward freedom. By the afternoon of June 6, 1944, the illusion of German control in Normandy had shattered. The Atlantic Wall, once called impregnable, was collapsing under relentless Allied fire. What began as isolated landings had become a full-scale invasion. German defenses, stretched thin, leaderless, and confused, were breaking apart. Communication lines were gone, bunkers destroyed, and soldiers wandered through smoke and ruin, unable to tell friend from foe. The Luftwaffe was nowhere. Allied planes ruled the skies, tearing apart every convoy that dared to move. The panzer divisions, Hitler's last hope, sat idle awaiting his command. In Berlin, he still believed the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Reinforcements never came. On the ground, desperation replaced duty. The Wehrmacht fought with courage but faced the unstoppable, naval fire, armor, and endless waves of men. By nightfall, resistance became chaos. Entire units withdrew into the countryside, abandoning the fortifications they had spent years building. The Atlantic Wall was nothing but rubble and memory. Retreat turned to panic. Soldiers trudged through mud and fire, dragging the wounded, haunted by the sound of Allied guns behind them. Civilians watched in silence as the occupiers who once ruled them fled. The myth of invincibility was dying in the ashes of Normandy. By June 7th, German command knew the truth, the front was broken beyond repair. Normandy was lost. The wall that was meant to hold for 1,000 years had fallen in a single day. As the sun set over the burning coast, one truth echoed through the ruins. The hunters of Europe had become the hunted.